Well, howdy everyone, my name's Chris, and today I'm taking a look at the Canon 24-105mm f4 IS USM L lens. I'm going to put it through its paces by testing it on my full frame camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. But I'll also include some test results from my Canon 60D for anyone who might want to use this lens on their APS-C camera. This is the typical kit lens that Canon includes with their expensive full-frame cameras, such as the 6D or the 5D Mark III. As you can see, the lens is pretty big, especially compared with Canon's APS-C kit lens. But that's not surprising. The lens has a constant maximum aperture of f4, so it's letting in more light, especially when you zoom in. It's a full-frame camera lens, so it's naturally going to be bigger. And also it has a much better zoom range of 24-105mm, which on a full frame camera is going from short telephoto to very wide angle. This is a fantastic focal range for any lens. You couldn't really ask for much more. And the constant f4 aperture is fantastic for video makers because as you zoom in and out, you don't get any annoying changes in light levels. So this is a Canon L lens, which means it has top-of-the-line build quality. Everything about the lens handles like a dream. It's very solidly made and looks the business. The zoom ring is very smooth indeed, although it's slightly uneven. At the wide end it zooms quickly, slowing down as you get to the telephoto end. The focus ring is extremely smooth and well damped, with just the right amount of travel for video work. The front element always stays still as you focus, unlike on cheaper lenses, and it also has full-time manual focusing, so you can adjust the focus whether or not you're set to auto or manual. The autofocus motor is extremely fast, silent, and very accurate. This lens has image stabilization, which works extremely well. As you've seen in all my video footage so far, it keeps your images very steady even as you're panning around and zooming in and out. That's another reason why this lens is fantastic for video work. It's also very useful for stills photography as f4 isn't the fastest maximum aperture in the world, so the lens doesn't exactly let in tons of light. But f4 isn't bad either. All in all, the image stabilization really helps. So overall, the lens handles fantastically well, which you might expect from a Canon L lens. It's an especially great lens for any kind of general video work. Although for low light work or shallow depth of field photography, you might want a lens with a faster aperture. Let's take a look at the image quality. We'll start by zooming out to 24mm, which is a very wide angle. With the aperture wide open at f4, you can immediately see some vignetting in the corners of the image. But this is normal for the wide angle of a zoom lens, and you can get rid of it with peripheral illumination on your camera. When we look in the middle of the image, we see that everything is nice and sharp. When we move over and look in the corners of the image, we can see that the lens is decently sharp with just a trace of chromatic aberration, visible in the edges of the window frames. Things are a lot better and brighter at f5.6, and at f8 the image quality is awesome, although you can still spot a tiny bit of chromatic aberration milling around. Let's zoom in to 40mm. Wide open at f4, things are still very nice and sharp in the middle, although it could be a touch sharper. Over in the corners, things are a little bit soft, but the chromatic aberration has cleared up and the image quality is nice. However, when we stop down to f5.6, the corners get sharp and bright, and we see excellent sharpness when we look back in the middle of the image. The image quality stays exactly the same, just as good, up to f11. When we zoom into 70mm, at f4, the image quality is fantastic in the middle of the frame. The corners also look great, very sharp and no chromatic aberration. At f5.6, the corners are even sharper and brighter. Again, the image quality remains really great, even as you stop down to f11 territory. Let's finally zoom all the way into 105mm. With the aperture wide open at f4, again the image is really sharp in the middle. The corners are fairly sharp, again with almost no chromatic aberration. Again, vignetting is quite strong, those corners look a bit dark. When we stop down to f5.6 though, everything becomes super sharp again, especially when we look in the middle of the image. So the Canon 24-105 isn't the most super crazy razor sharp lens out there. It's more like consistently great, which is all you can really ask for in a zoom lens, I think. It's a really solid performer. As you can see, the quality of this lens's bokeh is really nice and smooth, even at wider angles. Although the maximum aperture of f4 means it isn't always easy to get an out of focus background. As you can see here, the lens suffers from very strong barrel distortion at 24mm, which is quite disturbing and easy to see in everyday pictures. Thankfully at 35mm it straightens out, turning into moderate pincushion distortion at 50 and 105mm. The lens has a decent macro capability. It can focus down pretty close, which is good to see on a full frame camera. The close-up picture quality at f4 is pretty soft, but stop down to f5.6 and it gets really sharp. At the end of the day, this is simply a classic lens for full-frame cameras. It makes beautiful images all the time. Its colours and contrast and resistance to flare are fantastic, the bokeh is nice, it's consistently sharp, and the awesome build quality makes it a joy to use. The only thing I don't like about the 24-105 lens is its annoying distortion problems. That barrel distortion at 24mm really is a little wild. But anyone would be more than happy to fix this excellent lens to their camera, especially filmmakers. So, the lens is great for full frame cameras, but it also works on Canon's less expensive APS-C digital cameras, such as the Rebel series, the 7D, 60D, 70D. It's a less obvious choice because the widest angle of 24mm isn't really super wide on an APS-C camera. That's why Canon's normal kit lens starts at 18mm. In this footage, you can see 24mm on full frame and 24 on APS-C. It's still fairly wide though, so it won't really be a major problem to use this on your less expensive Canon Rebel camera. Let's take a quick look at the image quality for you. I got these shots on my 18MP Canon 60D. At 24mm with the aperture wide open at f4, the picture quality is nice and sharp in the middle, and it stays sharp as we look into the corners. If you look in the edges of the window frames, you'll see that the lens's chromatic aberration is slightly more pronounced, which is a typical effect of shooting on APS-C sensors. But frankly, the picture quality is excellent. There isn't much need to stop the lens down, as the picture quality remains just as sharp, and the mild chromatic aberration remains, even down to f8. Let's zoom into 55mm. At f4, the picture is nicely sharp from the middle to the corners, and there's no chromatic aberration. If you stop down to f5.6, the lens becomes incredibly sharp from corner to corner. A perfect performance. And finally, let's zoom into 105mm. At f4, the sharpness in the middle is very nice, although it's not razor sharp. The corners are almost as sharp, although unfortunately, chromatic aberration is rearing its head again. There's a good sharpness increase at f5.6, and the chromatic aberration is a little more under control, which brings about some really excellent image quality. The lens basically gives a great performance through and through. Everything else about the picture quality will remain fantastic on your APS-C camera, and as an added bonus, you won't have to deal with so much vignetting. Unfortunately, there's still some notable barrel distortion, although it's not as bad as on full frame. Here's the barrel distortion at 24mm and 35mm, but everything straightens out at 50mm to 105mm. So overall, on your APS-C camera, this lens will perform fantastically well, with only a couple of slight niggles. It's a shame it won't go wider than 24mm, but on the flip side, if you had an ultra-wide angle lens in your kit bag, like the Canon 10-22mm, the two lenses would complement each other really well. So that's one option, if you have a lot of money. The Canon 24-105mm f4 IS USM is not a perfect lens, but it certainly is fantastic, especially considering it's a zoom lens with such a long focal range. Whatever camera you have, this lens is a joy to use, especially for video work. This general purpose lens is highly recommended.